The draw of home is a powerful force. The opportunity to leave Toledo presents itself so often. Multiple times, I trialed a life outside of Northwest Ohio, and every time I have made my way back. Whether the call came from the lights of the big city, the tranquility of a natural paradise, or the potential of a startup hub, Toledo has always ended up calling me home. With roots firmly planted in Northwest Ohio, I sought out other people working to make this region all that it can be. That search brought me here today, sharing stories of the people improving this region every day. I'm Jacob Bekas, a community fellow at Midstory, and I'll be your host today. For the first 7 weeks of our show, you heard the story of Samuel Chang, one of our founders, and how his journey led him first to Toledo, then the East Coast, and then back to Toledo. Now you'll be hearing from some other members of the Midstory team. We'll be sharing our histories, what brought us to Toledo, and what we found in the Glass City. I was born at Toledo Hospital, one of the region's main hospitals, as the name suggests. I am at least a third-generation Toledoan on all sides of my family, but several branches of the family tree run much deeper than 3 generations. I have family members that are alumni of nearly every high school in the city and have worked at many of the city's most recognizable businesses and institutions, from the Jeep assembly plant to the Toledo Museum of Art. At every transition stage of my life, I was presented with ample opportunities to leave this region. So many that I am regularly surprised that I still call this place home. After graduating from St. Francis de Sales High School, I originally enrolled at The Ohio State University for college, until I switched to the University of Toledo at the last second. Throughout college, I took internships outside of the region, and I was dead set on wanting to work in a big city upon graduation. But a good opportunity came up close to home, so I stayed. A few years later, though, I did leave Toledo to pursue a different job. But I ended up coming right back upon realizing that the best opportunities for me could be done right here. This is where I find myself today, always flirting with leaving, but always deciding that Toledo is the best spot for me. There is a certain magnetism to this region that calls me time and time again to set roots here. Nearly a decade ago, as I was grappling with leaving Toledo, I met Sam Chang through a mutual friend. Sam had recently started an organization called Midstory, which had a mission to tell the stories of the Midwest and Toledo in particular. I loved the idea, and while I was away from Toledo, it kept me connected to home. As the years passed by, I continued to follow Midstory. Perhaps in part due to this work, I decided to come home and pursue a life in this region. In quite the coincidence, Sam reached out to me the week that I was moving back to Toledo. From there, we reconnected, and I was introduced to the rest of the Midstory team. Several years later now, I am thrilled to be part of Midstory and part of making Toledo the place we want it to be. Welcome to the Midstory Hour, a show produced by Midstory in collaboration with WGTE. Our stories this week span the elements: earth, fire, wind, and air, showing how the natural world can bring both peace and danger. Here at Midstory, we believe in the power of storytelling, especially about the places we call home. We've covered thousands of stories from across all 12 Midwest states, and each week on the Midstory Hour, we will share a few with you. Tune in every Saturday from 10 to 11 a.m. to learn something new about the place you call home. And likewise, learn something new about places you've never been. This week, listen to the 5th episode of the Copperhead Conspiracy, a podcast produced by Reckoning, Inc. in collaboration with Ohio Humanities. The Copperhead Conspiracy tells a little-known story from the Civil War about a treasonous Midwestern plot to bring down the Union. Next, learn about why the Midwest may be on track to become the country's next rowing hubspot. Last up is a story about a small island in Lake Erie that was once owned by President Rutherford B and could now be yours. If you enjoy this program, be sure to listen to other episodes and check us out at midstory.org or on our socials. As the Civil War dragged on, the Confederates and their allies in the Union began to abandon the traditional rules of warfare. Aiming to divert Union soldiers from the battlefront, they launched a series of brazen attacks from Canada, robbery, arson, and bioterrorism were all on the table as the Confederates worked to establish a northern front of the war. Here is Fire and Pestilence, the 5th episode of the Copperhead Conspiracy, an Ohio Humanities and Reckoning, Inc. podcast.
During the Civil War, Canada became a haven for thousands of Americans. For people fleeing slavery, it was the terminus for the Underground Railroad. It was a destination for draft dodgers and deserters from both sides of the conflict. It was a home for Confederate soldiers who had escaped from northern prisons, and for Copperheads who had been exiled from the United States. But it was also a home for several others who didn't quite fit into any of those categories. Take Kentuckian Luke Blackburn, a doctor who specialized in infectious diseases. From the start of the Civil War, he was determined to help the Confederacy however he could. He served as a surgeon for the Confederate Army, then as a state medical commissioner in Mississippi. Next, he became a blockade runner, overseeing shipments of needed provisions from Canada. During this period, he began to contemplate a scheme for how he could help the Confederacy even more by using his medical skills in a different way.
Dr. Luke Blackburn was one of the foremost specialists when it came to yellow fever.
Julian Schur is a journalist and the author of The North Star, Canada and the Civil War Plots Against Lincoln.
Yellow fever was this terrifying plague. Nobody knew what caused it. There was no cure, and there would be breakouts all through the South and in the Caribbean islands. And Blackburn had earned a reputation for fighting yellow fever. As the Civil War breaks out, Luke Blackburn is in Barbados at a yellow fever clinic treating voluntarily these patients. And while everybody is enamored by his generosity, it'll turn out that later on nurses and others will wonder about some of his strange activity, because he is collecting the soiled linen and the clothing of patients who are dying and storing it away. And what he did, we later discover, is he packed all these clothing that he assumed was infected with this terrifying disease into 6 trunks, had it shipped to Halifax, a major Confederate sympathizing city in Canada, where he was staying briefly. And with an agent, he gets 6 trunks shipped to various northern cities. He openly talks to his fellow conspirators about a plot to kill thousands. He calls it, this is his words, an infallible plan directed against the masses of northern people slowly to create death. I mean, it's basically bioterrorism, right? The clothing is shipped and it's sold in various stores in Boston, Philadelphia, 2 cities that had a heavy Union troop presence, New Bern in North Carolina and Norfolk, Virginia. He actually gives instructions to his fellow conspirator to send one trunk, he nicknamed it Big Number 2, to Washington. And the idea was to send some clothes to Lincoln in the White House. What Blackburn didn't know at the time, and nobody knew, it was only in 1901, we discovered that yellow fever is caused by mosquitoes, not by infected people or infected clothes. But nobody knew that at the time. So at the time, both Blackburn and the Confederates, who knew what they were doing, knew they were engaged in what they thought was bioterrorism.
That's what things had come to, as the nation had entered into the 4th year of the Civil War. Both sides had apparently abandoned the traditional soldier-against-soldier model of warfare to one where civilian casualties weren't just an unfortunate byproduct, but the actual aim of the operation. This was true for the Union with Sherman's so-called March to the Sea, and it was definitely true for the Confederates' plan to unleash yellow fever on unsuspecting northern citizens. And they still hadn't given up on the idea of a violent uprising in a major U.S. city. This is the Copperhead Conspiracy. I'm Dan Getteman. At the same time that Luke Blackburn was trying to use bioterrorism to advance the cause of the Confederacy, Captain Thomas Hines and his Confederate superiors were still looking for a way to free large numbers of soldiers from Union POW camps by collaborating with the Sons of Liberty. They decided to essentially follow the same plan that they had hoped to execute during the Chicago Convention, but this time it would be targeted to disrupt another political milestone. Election Day, November 8, 1864. However, as with their previous attempt to free the prisoners at Chicago's Camp Douglas, there was again a spy among the Confederates. In this case, his name was John Shanks, a Confederate prisoner who had changed allegiance to support the Union. He was reporting regularly to Colonel Benjamin Sweet, the camp's commander, about what he was learning regarding the planned prison break on Election Day. The plan called for a two-pronged attack. Captain Thomas Hines and the local armed militias would strike the camp from the outside, while prisoners would revolt from within. Much of it revolved around Charles Walsh, a local leader of the Sons of Liberty who lived very near to the prison. To learn what happened next, we turn to a letter written by Captain James Cornelius, an officer serving at Camp Douglas. He is writing to his wife, Harriet.
Last night, about midnight, Colonel Sweet ordered a detail of 50 men and 2 officers to arrest a Mr. Walsh. We quietly surrounded the house and then woke the family up. They at first refused to open the door, but we coaxed them to do it by calling on 3 or 4 men to apply the butts of their muskets to the door. In we went, 3 officers and half a dozen men with bayonets fixed. We put a pair of bracelets on Mr. Walsh and his son and sent them off to camp under a military escort. We then informed the ladies that we desired to inspect their home. At this, the ladies scampered upstairs, and in a moment, a couple of gentlemen were seen crawling out of the window and clambering over the roof of the house. In a moment, 1 or 2 dozen rifles were pointing at them, calling to them to surrender, which they did unconditionally. We then minutely inspected the inside of the building and were rewarded for our labors with the following discoveries: 300 revolvers, 150 double-barreled shotguns, 15,000 rounds of ball cartridges, 15,000 percussion caps, 2 kegs of powder, 200 pounds buckshot in sacks, and a lot of buckshot cartridges. Your affectionate husband, J.E. Cornelius.
In addition to those apprehended at the home of Charles Walsh, scores of other Copperheads and Confederate soldiers were arrested around the city. In early 1865, many of them were put on trial by a military commission, and several went to prison. One person, however, who completely escaped capture was Captain Thomas Hines, the organizer of the entire effort. He evaded Union troops who had learned of his location by hiding in the bed of a local Confederate sympathizer, a woman who claimed to be bedridden. And so by Election Day 1864, everything attempted by the Copperheads and Confederates to change the course of the war had failed. No uprisings, no prisoners released, and Vallandigham wasn't the presidential nominee. Newspapers were filled with details from the treason trials of the Sons of Liberty, which in the public eye had transformed the Democrats into a party of traitors. Not surprisingly, when the votes were tallied, Lincoln had defeated the Democratic nominee George McClellan by a wide margin in the Electoral College and received 55% of the popular vote, much of it from Union soldiers who voted overwhelmingly for their commander-in-chief. You would think that marks the end of our story, that the Copperheads would give up their fight and get on with the business of winning the war and then reconstructing the South. But that wasn't the case. For some of the most determined Copperheads, and certainly for Thomas Hines and his Confederate colleagues, the fight was only beginning. They would now pivot to new techniques intended to instill terror among citizens and force the Union Army to divert troops to an emerging northern front.
Perhaps the most successful and brazen attack by the Confederates was the raid on St. Albans.
Again, author Julian Schur.
Bennett Young was one of Morgan's raiders. He'd been a divinity student, quite a charming man, very handsome, very smart. And in the fall of 1864, he will lead a small group of Confederates. They cross the border. St. Albans is the first town you hit when you cross into the United States from Quebec. Young and his men come into St. Albans. They check in to a hotel, and at 3 o'clock, Young steps out, fires a gun in the air, and says, "In the name of the Confederate States, I am taking over this town." In 15 minutes, they raid 3 banks, steal over $250,000 in the currency of the day. They kill an innocent bystander. They try to burn the town as they gallop away. They don't succeed, and they cross the border. Panic ensues. Many people in the North think more raids are going to happen. Lincoln orders his army to respond. The American general who's stationed on the northern border quite seriously thinks of invading Canada. And instead, a posse crosses into Canada, and most of the raiders, including Bennett Young, are arrested. The trial takes place. Unbeknownst to most people, the judge has handed the money that was taken from the robbers to the Montreal police chief for safekeeping. Turns out the Montreal police chief was a secret sympathizer of the Confederates. The judge throws out the case on a technicality. Bennett Young and the Confederates cheer. They get into a sled that has been stationed there for them because they knew that the verdict would be in their favor, race to the bank, in effect steal the money a second time, and then escape. Many of them make it back to the States. Bennett Young is captured again, put on trial, and again acquitted. So you can imagine the outrage. And by then, newspapers in Chicago and New York are openly talking about invading Canada, saying that Canada is like a poodle and should be choked.
A month after the raid on St. Albans, another of the young Confederate soldiers in Canada, John Headley, took the helm of an even more adventurous attack. This time, the plan was to burn down New York City.
Now, why does he choose New York? Well, part of the reason, of course, is that it was the biggest city, the metropolis, and he really wanted to strike terror. In fact, it's fascinating. One of the Richmond papers in the Confederate capital was so outraged at the burn and destroy tactics that Lincoln's Union Army was devastating on the South. They say in their editorial, it's time for Confederates in Canada to do the same thing and turn Northern City into ashes.
From the Richmond Whig, October 15th, 1864. There is one effectual way, and only one that we know of, to arrest and prevent this and every other sort of atrocity. And that is to burn one of the chief cities of the enemy and let its fate hang over the others as a warning of what might be done to them if the present system of war on the part of the enemy is continued. If we are asked how such a thing can be done, we answer, nothing would be easier. $1 million will lay the proudest city of the enemy in ashes. The men to execute the work are already there. There would be no difficulty in finding in Canada suitable persons to take charge of the enterprise and arrange its details. 20 men with plans all preconcerted and means provided, selecting some dry, windy night, might fire Boston in 100 places and wrap it up in flames from center to suburb. They might retaliate on Richmond, Charleston, etc. Let them do so if they dare. It is a game at which we can beat them. New York is worth 20 Richmonds.
So Headley and his men check into 19 different hotels, under disguises, of course, and they bring along what was called Greek fire, kind of Molotov cocktails. So they check into these hotels and they light these bottles of Greek fire in their hotel rooms and throw chairs and hotel linen on the beds. And the smoke billows out of the hotels. The goal was to burn down all of Broadway and Hope, much of the city as well. Now, they made a fatal mistake. To try not to be discovered, they shut the doors on the hotel rooms and the windows, and so eventually the fires ran out of oxygen. So remarkably, there was a lot of damage, but nobody died. But it was seen as a terror plot, and the headlines the next day said openly this was a terror plot from Canada.
Despite an intense manhunt conducted throughout New York City after the attacks, John Headley and his men were able to board a train for Albany, and from there traveled to Toronto. 2 days later, they learned that New York detectives had followed them to Toronto, so they once again escaped, and all but one of them eventually made it back to Confederate territory. The exception was Robert Cobb Kennedy, who was arrested as he changed trains in Detroit and was later tried, convicted, and sentenced to death at a military hearing. In March 1865, he was hanged at Fort Lafayette in New York, the last Confederate soldier to be executed during the Civil War. In the aftermath of the failed attempt to burn down New York City, and as news from the southern battlefronts continued to be bleak, a new Confederate plan of action emerged, taking the fight directly to Washington in a last-ditch attempt to free Confederate prisoners. The plan was, at once, quite simple and completely audacious. Find a time when President Abraham Lincoln was regularly out of the White House and accompanied by a few others, and then kidnap him, take him to Virginia, and use him as a hostage, to force the Union to release Confederate soldiers from their prisons. Confederate Captain Thomas Conrad explained what was planned in a memoir he published after the war.
We soon learned that the president left the executive mansion in the cool of the evening in his private carriage and was driven directly to the soldiers' home on the northern outskirts of the city, and that he usually spent the night having telegraphic communication with the White House. This he did every pleasant day. The next thing for us to do was to determine the best point along his line of drive at which we should halt the carriage and make the president our captive. The soldiers' home was surrounded by a large acreage of grand old forest trees, and the grounds were laid out with winding driveways. The 14th Street entrance was the one usually entered by the president's carriage, and was admirably adapted for our purposes. We selected this point as the place for halting the carriage, just after it entered the grounds. On Friday evening, we were on hand to see the president's carriage move out from the White House on its way to the soldiers' home. Imagine my astounding surprise and total collapse when we beheld the carriage of Mr. Lincoln was preceded and followed by a squad of cavalry. What can it mean? Have our plans been betrayed and our movements been suspected? I knew no one of our quartet ever breathed our scheme, and that our movements had never awakened the shadow of suspicion. The only solution at all satisfactory is that there must have been another set of Confederates seeking the same end. and some one of them had given it away by some indiscretion, or whose movements had awakened suspicion that led to the precautionary protection.
As it happens, there was another set of Confederates seeking the same end, or at least a group of Confederate sympathizers, which included two men, one already quite famous as an actor, and the other soon to be a household name. Their names were John Wilkes Booth and John Surratt.
So Booth first comes up with the idea, as other Confederates had, to kidnap Lincoln. Now, you could argue the chances of kidnapping the president and not harming or killing him are perhaps slim, but initially he just wanted to kidnap Lincoln. Why? Because he wanted to use a kidnapped Lincoln as leverage to free those tens of thousands of prisoners in northern prisons where so many Confederates were held. So in the summer of 1864, he meets with a couple of his close friends and discloses his plot to kidnap Lincoln, and they agree. Then Booth travels to Montreal, ostensibly because he wants to ship some of his clothing for his various plays around the blockade. But he will essentially use that to meet with various Confederate agents. We know that he's playing cards with leading Confederate agents, including Dr. Luke Blackburn, the father of the Yellow Fever plot, George Sanders, the Confederate agent who was involved in so many Confederate plots, prominent Southern politicians. He is plotting his kidnap attempt. He leaves Montreal, is shattered when Lincoln wins election in November, and now his kidnap plot speeds up. He meets with a man named John Surratt. John Surratt was, like Booth, a very handsome young man. Unlike Booth, he was a known paid Confederate agent. He was a courier. He was very good at his job. His mother ran a rooming house in Washington. The family also owned a post office station not far from Washington. And Booth meets with Surratt. Surratt is known as a fine horseman, a fine shot, and he is supposed to play the leading role in the kidnap plot. And the men are all meeting, eating oysters at a fine restaurant in Washington, and they're putting the final touches on their plot to kidnap Lincoln. And at one point, there was an idea, maybe we could kidnap him at a theater, and then they say, no, at one point he's going to be traveling on a road, so we could jump on the horses then and kidnap him. And Booth at one point suggests, and of course I'm paraphrasing here, Booth at one point suggests, if the kidnap doesn't work or if things go wrong, we may have to go to extremes. And the men quite rightly interpret this as a suggestion of killing Lincoln. And several of them profess, no, we don't want to go that far. And Booth kind of retracts and they agree it'll be a kidnapping. Everything is staged for the kidnap. John Surratt is ready for his role. They're actually waiting and hiding along the highway. But at the last minute, Lincoln cancels his plan to make that trip, and the kidnap plot foils. And just a couple of months later, Booth, frustrated now, decides he will go all the way and assassinate Lincoln.
Next time, in the conclusion of our series, we'll see how, in the aftermath of the Lincoln assassination, efforts to investigate a connection between the assassination and the Confederate government were disrupted by yet another of the Confederate agents based in Canada, an agent who was known to have associated with John Wilkes Booth.
Sanders is chatting with John Wilkes Booth, and he's approached by a well-known British journalist. He says, "We are talking about things that will make the world shudder in a few months."
That's next time on our last episode of the Copperhead Conspiracy. The Copperhead Conspiracy is a production of Reckoning, Inc., with funding and scholarly assistance from Ohio Humanities. It was produced and narrated by me, Dan Getteman. Our historical consultant was Dr. Stephen Rockenbach. Voice actors were Alec Voles and Barrett Cooper. Our theme music was composed by Ja'Cory Arthur, with other music licensed from Blue Dot Sessions. Special thanks to Nina Ellis, Louisville Public Media, and to Loretta Williams for editorial guidance. Major support for this series was provided by Archon Construction. Additional support from Jay and Susan Giles, Doreen Juha Sauer, Lopa Mehrotra, and Douglas and Marissa Brown. Many thanks to author Julian Schur, whose interview was heard throughout this program. And special thanks to Stephen Town for providing one of the newspaper articles read in this episode. If you would like to support our nonprofit organization and unlock bonus episodes of this series, you can do so at patreon.com/reckoningradio. Our first bonus episode explains all the key events in American history that led to the Civil War. You can access that and more at patreon.com/reckoningradio. For transcripts, a bibliography, and other content related to this series, please visit our website at copperheadconspiracy.org. That's copperheadconspiracy.org. And if you haven't already done so, please leave a review of this series on whatever platform you use to hear it. It will really help other listeners to find this podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Please join us next time for another episode of the Copperhead Conspiracy.
If you're just joining us now, you're currently listening to the Midstory Hour. Tune in every Saturday from 10 to 11 a.m. to hear hidden stories from Toledo, the Midwest, and beyond. You can also find this podcast on midstory.org or wgte.org, or wherever you get your podcasts.
The Midwest is farm country. Infinite horizons of corn and soybeans tilled by grizzled farmers on their green John Deere tractors. At least, that's what we've been told to believe about the region. But that stereotype sells us woefully short on the Midwest's $150 billion economic engine, a true powerhouse in the nation's heartland.
The ag industry is one of the best kept secrets.
Farmers for many years haven't really shared their story of what they do and how they're passionate about it.
But the region's farms are facing big challenges.
Soil erosion is causing serious problems for farmers all across the Midwest.
Scientists believe America's breadbasket could soon be empty, and they're warning a relentless drought is harming the nation's wheat crops.
Historic flooding damaging farming communities and raising fears that food prices could climb.
Sometimes the industry only has itself to blame. Farming practices have eroded soils and polluted waterways, inflicting serious damage on the environment. Big Ag is responsible for 10% of America's greenhouse gas emissions, and warming temperatures and extreme weather have wreaked havoc on the growing season. But the field is also full of people striving to find a better way forward. There are champions of soil and water management, innovators in cutting-edge technologies, advocates for social and economic justice, and even everyday people turning back to the land to find purpose in tumultuous times.
You can still do business with a handshake.
My word is my bond. And that's why I love ag so much.
It's our natural instinct to feel like we're stewards of the land. You can't go out and make new land at any time. So whatever we have as an industry, we feel that we've got to keep.
The Midwestern farmer is so productive. There was really no stopping them in terms of what they could do.
The grass certainly looks greener on the far side of this crisis. But how do we get there? And what could the farm and the farmer of tomorrow look like? I'm Yannick Schaller, and this is Greener Pastures, a brand new Midstory podcast on the future of farming in the Midwest. Not everyone shares the same vision of what's to come, but the conversation about what ag has gotten wrong and what it still can get very, very right maybe it should start with the farmers themselves. Isn't it time we started listening to what they have to say? The Midwest as you've never seen it. Farming as you've never known it. And what a fresh understanding of land, water, and food could hold for us all. Tune in to episode 1 of Greener Pastures on midstory.org, WGTE, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Rowing is not a sport typically associated with the Midwest. The oldest intercollegiate sport in the U.S., rowing has historically been dominated by teams from New England and the West Coast, which both have strong rowing cultures. In the Midwest, by contrast, a lack of infrastructure for rowers at both the high school and collegiate levels has hampered rowers' chances of success. But this may be changing, especially in women's rowing, which benefits from Title IX funding at the collegiate level. This winter, intern Julia Hack set out to investigate what the future might hold for rowing in the Midwest. She chats with fellow Celia Johnson about her findings.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here and to talk about my story. My story is about rowing in the Midwest and how the Midwest has risen to potentially being a new rowing hotspot amidst a sea of East Coast programs.
And what got you interested in reporting on this story?
I'm rowing myself. So I'm a walk-on the rowing team at Princeton University. And since starting rowing, I got a lot more interested in everything that is behind the sport. And after starting at Midstory, I was wondering how I could connect my interest to the Midwest. And after talking to my teammates from the Midwest, I noticed that there are actually a couple of interesting dynamics happening that are worth reporting on.
So let's talk a little bit about what's behind rowing. So what's the history of rowing? And as you mentioned, right, a lot of the popular programs are in the New England area. So why is that?
So these are basically two questions. First, the history of rowing. Rowing started as a transportation method. That was how rowing was invented, but it quickly developed to a sport for fun or for competitions, for social events, etc., rather than being this transportation method. Um, and this is also the reason why rowing is so concentrated on the East Coast, because rowing is centered a lot around wealth. And on the East Coast, there's a lot of wealth centered, which means that rowing clubs can flourish there. And what I mean is by it centers around wealth is that it requires a lot of expensive infrastructure, such as, for example, buying the boats, buying the oars, building a boathouse, building these networking connections that are necessary to fund a rowing club. And this is why it is really centered to the East Coast.
It makes sense if, your sport dates back to, the late 1700s, the early 1800s. Now, a lot of the Midwest was being developed at that time, right? So you just have these boathouses in New England that have been around longer than some places in the Midwest have even existed.
Yes, that is very true.
So let's talk about these powerhouse schools, these New England schools, and then maybe a little bit about some of these Midwest programs that you think are on the rise.
hmm so I would consider the traditional East Coast Ivy League schools as those powerhouse schools for rowing that are classic schools from the East Coast. They did really start early in the early 1800s in university competitions. So this is where the tradition comes from. But there are a lot of new rowing clubs emerging also in the Midwest. For example, the University of Michigan's women's team is really successful. They started as a club team, but after 2 seasons, they managed to become a varsity team and are competing on a top level now.
Wow, I imagine that's quite an unusual trajectory for a sport.
I actually spoke to the head coach of the women's rowing team at the University of Michigan, and I think that his passion is part of the reason because he like once he stepped in, it only took the team 2 years to get to varsity. But I think there's also a lot of funding and jurisdiction behind it. I think the reason for rowing emerging more, especially for women, is Title IX, that should ensure more gender equality, and this applies to athletics too. And if you know, Michigan is really big on football. They have a big football team, the Wolverines. You can imagine that a lot of budget goes into this football team. And Title IX says that an equal amount of money has to be spent on a women's sport, and that this amount of money is a lot that goes into women's rowing, and therefore this also supports their athletic success.
Well, that's great for them. I mean, it certainly indicates that if they're able to progress this quickly, it's not only due to, the passion of the coach or the funding, but just due to, the talent in the team itself. So let's talk a little bit about what it takes to make it onto a college rowing team. So, I mean, what age do people start rowing?
I actually asked around in my rowing team about this question, and the average that people answered was that they started around 12, 13 years old to row. So it's like the typical age is when you would enter high school. You could also start to row. I also spoke to one of my teammates who was a recruit at Princeton who only started at 16. So it seems like a sport that you can also start at a later age. Um, and it is not the same as with, because it's not that technical, but more about physical ability. It is not the same as, like, let's say soccer or gymnastics, where you have to start when you're 5 years old. It is possible to start later, and since rowing is known for taking a lot of walk-ons, a lot of athletes only start in their college years.
Was that true of you? Did you have experience before you walked onto the team?
No, I didn't have experience before. I started in my freshman
Oh,
fall as
that's
well.
very cool.
Yeah.
Did you play some sort of sport before then that helped you transition though?
Um, I played rugby, but I played rugby in Germany, and in Germany, athletics are not taken very seriously. So I can not really compare this.
Oh, that's very impressive then to have not so much experience and to get onto a
Yeah.
team. So you might not need as much experience as you need with something that's more technical like soccer, but I imagine that school experience still helps you prepare for the college stage. So I know you spoke to some Midwestern rowers, and what did they have to say about how they felt their experiences rowing in high school differed from some of their peers they know now who came from the East Coast?
Yeah. The high school experience does indeed prepare rowers to row at college, especially if they want to get recruited. And I spoke to one of my teammates from the Midwest. She actually did not get recruited, but was a preferred walk-on on the team. And she was telling me about her experience in the Midwest, that she didn't face as much competition. She was especially telling an anecdote from one of her teammates who was really, really good. She was qualifying for nationals, and at regionals, she was blasting everyone away by boat length, but she never really learned how it is to be in a dogfight and to have to push the very last bit of power out of you, which is why it was a lot harder for her to compete in nationals. And then there is also a social aspect that comes to it. She is, I think, one of only two women from the Midwest on our team,
Wow.
and and all of the recruits came from the New York, New Jersey area. Um, and of course, they already know each other because their high school clubs competed against each other. They sat in the same boat at times, and they've done the same programs. They've went to the same social events. So they already have this cycle that is the circle that is established, where Midwestern rowers might struggle to find the same place in the community.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be really tough. I mean, are there efforts from people to create, I don't know, a stronger rowing culture in the Midwest?
I would say that there are efforts to create a stronger rowing culture in the Midwest, and this is promoted just through the success of the rowing teams that have been um, that have come from the Midwest. For example, the University of Michigan won a lot of titles. They've been really successful, and I think they can be a role model for other universities to follow.
Right, and I imagine they could be a role model for, high school kids in the area looking up to that team
Yeah,
as well.
exactly. And I think since Michigan's team became a varsity women's team, they are also able to recruit people now. And if people see that you can get into college by rowing really, really good, they might feel the incentive to start early in high school.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. And did the Midwestern rowers you spoke to say anything about what they felt like the future of Midwestern rowing would look like?
The coach of the men's rowing team at Michigan um, told me that he would not be surprised if Michigan will be one of the best rowing states in the future.
Well, they have a lot of water there.
Yeah, exactly. Um, that is why it's actually made for rowing because of all the water that is in Michigan.
Well, great, Julia. It was great to speak with you. I learned so much about a sport I really didn't know anything about.
Mark your calendars for Saturday, April 11th for the largest regional pickleball tournament held at the University of Toledo, the Toledo Pickleball Classic and Career Futures Expo. The event is free and open to the public and will feature tournaments across corporate teams, UToledo student orgs, and local high schoolers, a Career Futures Expo with 80-plus companies looking for the next round of talent, and a community carnival with bouncy houses, a free kids pickleball clinic, food trucks, and more. Visit ToledoPickleballClassic.org for more info.
Every year, millions of people flock to Lake Erie in the summertime to enjoy its warm beaches and bucolic islands. In the 1800s, one of those people was future President Rutherford B. Hayes, who bought a small island named Mouse Island for him and his family to enjoy. A nature lover's paradise, it was a vacation spot for several generations of the Hayes family before being sold in the 1960s. Now the island is on the market again, and for just $5 million, it could be yours. Intern Adan Kwan spoke with fellow Evan Blanco about the island and its unique history.
Over the past few weeks, I've been working on this story about Mouse Island, which is an island that was once owned by Rutherford B. Hayes, former U.S. president and governor of Ohio.
So what got you interested in the story?
Yeah, so it's not every day that you get to write a story about something that a former U.S. president owned, and it's also not every day that a former U.S. president's property goes on sale. So, yeah, that was kind of the hook for me. But yeah, even though Hayes isn't super well known, there's that Midwest Ohio connection. It's just pretty interesting and compelling that he once owned this, tiny Lake Erie island, but he and his family felt so strongly about it, and they, really enjoyed their time there.
Nice. So where is this island? How big is it?
Yeah, so the island's just off the coast of Catawba Island, which is, a bit down the coast from Toledo, and it's pretty small. It's only 7 acres.
And it's just mostly wooded?
Yeah, it's mostly wooded. There's like a rocky beach based on some of the pictures that we have of the island. It's, pretty small. Not a lot can fit on there.
Yeah,
so-
not very developed. So tell me a little bit more of the details. What's the history of this island?
Yeah, so Hayes actually bought the island with some friends. So he bought it with Ralph Buckland, who was a Civil War general, and his law partner, and L.Q. Rawson, who was a local doctor. So they all bought the island together in 1873 in August. A few years later, in 1879, Hayes bought Rawson's share, so that's the doctor. So it was just him and Buckland that owned the island at that point. And then 11 years later, in 1900, Hayes actually trades the Buckland family for land that they jointly owned in Nebraska for the remainder of the island. So by that time, Hayes became the sole owner of the island. And about 6 decades later, Hayes is gone by then, but his descendants now own the island, and they actually decide to sell it in 1966. Hayes himself didn't actually sell the island. There were actually several inquiries when he was the owner about buying the island, but he refused to sell it. So it was just his descendants that actually decided to sell it.
So he bought it with some friends. He slowly bought up their shares. He rejected any bids to buy the island, and then his family just held on to it for decades.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so what were the Hayes family getting up to on the island? What did they do?
Yeah, so it's, if you've ever been to any of the Great Lakes, any islands on there. It was pretty typical activities for vacationers. Fishing, boating, picnics, a lot of outdoor stuff. A lot of the pictures just show them like hanging around on the shore or in a boat, on a dock.
Okay, so if this was one powerful family, vacationing on Lake Erie, what does a typical, non-presidential Lake Erie coast vacation look like?
Yeah. So obviously, Cedar Point's in the area, so that's a pretty big draw. That gets about, according to Shores and Islands, Ohio, which is the tourism agency for the area, it gets about 4 million visitors each year. The Erie and Ottawa counties combined, that they occupy the area where Mouse Island is, they get about 13.3 million visitors annually. So quite a few. And the typical activities are, traveling out to the Lake Erie Islands during the summer, those warmer months. There's like, restaurants, boating, fishing, all of those
Mhm.
typical island activities.
Who were some of the experts that you talked to for the story? What did you learn from them?
I spoke with Julie Mayle, the curator of manuscripts at the Hayes Presidential Library and Museums. So she gave quite a bit of insight into the images and that the museum had. So they sent over a few scanned images that they had of not Hayes himself, but his descendants
Mhm.
on the island, enjoying their time. So they had some scans and they kind of gave some more context about who's in those images, like, what they're up to, the other things that they wrote about doing or enjoying on the island. And she also provided some pretty valuable context about the island itself and its history, um, like who owned it before, when it was sold. I also spoke to Ben Simon, who is the marketing director for Shores and Islands, Ohio. That's the tourism agency for Ottawa and Erie County. Yeah, he provided some insight into some of those tourism figures, the typical activities that people get up to nowadays in that area where Mouse Island is.
Okay, cool. So the Hayes family sold it, and that was in the 60s, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So how much did it sell for, and how much are they looking to get now that it's for sale again?
Yeah, so it sold for just about $16,500. But right now the asking price is 5 million.
Whoa, that's a big difference. Why is it worth so much more now?
I'm actually not sure myself, but I would guess it's like a changing real estate market, land values, and it is being marketed as a potential development
Mm.
opportunity. Howard Hanna, the realty company that's in charge, is, suggesting condos, apartments, or even, just a private island to yourself. One could build um, private home,
Mhm.
anything really. So I'm guessing it's that potential for development.
Okay, that makes sense. What was your favorite part of reporting the story?
For me, I think it was seeing all the historic photos. I love historic documents
Mhm.
and primary sources. Um, and, learning about one of the lesser known US presidents, through these photos and like getting a glimpse into his life and, his family and, kind of legacy through the
Yeah,
island and what his family enjoyed.
for sure. And just as we wrap up, are there any interesting anecdotes or story that maybe you didn't have the space to include in your article, but you want to share now?
Hayes did visit the island a few times during his presidency, but records indicate that he had to spend most of his time in Washington, as one would expect for a U.S. president.
Okay, so even though he bought it and he clearly loved it, he didn't really spend that much time there. Were there other members of his family that maybe enjoyed the island since he didn't get to spend that much time?
Yeah, so his son actually wrote from the island while Hayes was president, and he talked about just, some of the things he enjoyed about the island. And he talked about how much the island was like praised
Hmm.
by people who visited them during their stay.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your reporting.
Thanks for listening to the Midstory Hour. We have a full lineup for our next episode, so tune in next Saturday at 10 a.m. to hear more about Midstory, our home in our greater region. If you have a story you'd like to share or just would like to drop us a note, please contact us at contact@midstory.org. We'd love to hear from you. The Midstory Hour is a Midstory podcast produced in collaboration with WGTE. It features original work produced by our dedicated team of reporters, researchers, data analysts, and creators. This episode was hosted and written by Jacob Bekas and edited by Evan Blanco. Artwork is by Ruth Chang and Joshua Rep. This week's episode featured stories by the Greater Midstory team, including Celia Johnson, Evan Blanco, Julia Hack, and Adan Kwan. Midstory is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to progressing the Midwest narrative through multimedia storytelling, solutions-oriented research, and community programming. Founded in 2018 by 4 individuals who found their way home from the East Coast to Toledo, Ohio, Midstory re-envisions the Midwest story through a productive, bright, and influential future. Learn more at www.midstory.org.